We used to recite them on the way to school, and sometimes as we were coming home, walking from elementary school to our neighborhood. They went something like this: the rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, or the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. I remember the one that I like the best. This is the dog that worried the cat, that killed the rat, that ate the malt, that lay in the house that Jack built. Remember that one? As the old rhyme says, it means to tell the whole story. Don't leave anything out. Don't deny or neglect some aspect about the rhyme of life. It is to say, as it relates to the Christian gospel, that you and I are invited to tell the whole story, to honestly declare the entire epic. The dog and the cat and the rat and the malt in the house and, yes, Jack. Or how about also including the man all tattered and torn who kissed the maid all forlorn, or the priest all shaven and shorn? All this is to say that Jack's house, but more importantly in the Christian gospel, Jesus of Nazareth is at the center of the wheel, and all the spokes that go out from that centering have a story to be told. Your story and mine, as it is lived in God, it includes all aspects and all pieces. And you and I are bid not to leave anything out. The many journeys of life, and in the middle of those journeys, there is a central question, and that is, how are we to find spiritual wholeness in the midst of all of the challenges that can happen this side of heaven? It's the question, really, and the Apostle Paul is raising it to the Corinthians in his second letter, which is our epistle text for this week. Paul's conclusion, his first conclusion to asking the question, how are you and I to find spiritual wholeness in the midst of all the challenges, Jack and the house and the rat and everything that can happen? How are we to find that wholeness in the midst of all of the challenges? His first conclusion is that you and I have to look at the whole, all the pieces of our journey, the good and the bad, those moments when we're faithful and those moments when we are full of doubt, how you and I will negotiate the various things that can happen on our faith pilgrimage along the way. The Apostle Paul is honest in this text to say it has to take in the whole, even our worst days, and the Apostle Paul is having some bad days as he writes the letter, the second letter to the Corinthians. It reminds me of all of the challenges that you and I have to face: illness and death and vocational setback and relationships that run sour and all kinds of other havoc that can happen in our world. I remember years ago an elderly woman who's in another parish had a farmhouse fire one night. It was a cold January. The farmhouse had been in her family 3 generations. It's as Texans talk about 4 or 5 generations on the ranch. Some of you have that kind of legacy. So you can imagine what this woman went through, the trauma of a farmhouse fire that she had lived in her whole life, was a member of our congregation. I remember she nearly died in that fire because as she was roaming around that rambling farmhouse, what she was trying to do is to throw out of the windows all of the heirlooms, the photos, and the small pieces of furniture that she could heave out of the window, including all the keepsakes that had been handed down to her by her great-grandparents. While throwing out of the window all of the heirlooms, she tried to save 3 generations of history and of journey. The firefighters later told me they had to drag her out kicking and screaming, even though the fire was leaping at her feet, literally. Later on, the next week, she shared with me that in the hospital room, recovering from the fire, She felt like an old hen in a dark corner of despair. Of course, we knew her as much more than just the farmhouse, as much more than just an old woman in a corner of darkness and despair. In fact, in her room, which is her life, we knew her as a woman of great faith and service, a one of hope and inspiration. But on this particular day in the hospital, having lost what she lost, she was not full of that upper side of her life, but had been cast down. She was asking Paul's question, how am I to find wholeness in the midst of this challenge that has happened in my life, this fire that has burned down 3 generations of my history? In the midst of many challenges, I like to think that a great many of us take seriously what Paul says in this text. Though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. To know life as a journey, and that it's not just an outward journey, but it's an inward journey, is to know that the physical world is where we begin, but the spiritual world is where we find our real home. It's as Ezekiel said generations before, it's a new spirit and a new flesh. For death is only a horizon, we say at the burial service, and a horizon is nothing save the limit of our sight. In the past 2 months, but any month, but especially the last 2 months, we have had some difficult deaths in our congregation. We've said goodbye to some very important people. Many wonderful souls have been laid to rest. And beside those grave sites, here in our columbarium and other places, we have said in the midst of our tears and grief what an old English king said, "Weep not, for I shall not die. And as I leave the land of the dying, I trust to see the blessings of the Lord in the land of the living." It's on those occasions in the midst of grief that you and I declare the last word of this Christian pilgrimage, and that is resurrection. The Apostle Paul is talking about, among all the journeys, those spokes that go out from the core, the last word in the Christian journey is resurrection. That it's not just those things that have been seen, but it's the inward, unseen realities of the Christian pilgrimage that we hold on to. I've been very intrigued by paleontologists. They're the ones who fiddle around with fossils. They're the ones who tell us all about the history of how we've come into where we are now, how those fossils tell a story about the journeys of those who've gone before. I'm intrigued by paleontologists because those fossils that they've discovered have told us that we've been around for a long time, but the earth has been around lots longer. That all the earth and sky and sea and land was being shaped and formed, and then we came along millions of years ago and began to add our story to the paleontologists. I can still remember the day in 5th grade when Mr. Hale told us wide-eyed kids about the length of human history. And he said, if you take all of the world's history and then you put the human part in the middle of it, it's like putting a nickel on the height of the Empire State Building. That's how much length that you and I have given to the planet's history. If you put a nickel on the top of the Empire State Building. Now, I have to say, that's putting life in perspective, wouldn't you? And then again in high school, you and I learned that in that human history, that we have put a real crimp in the journeys of indigenous people. That we were made to be on a journey, and the indigenous people are the ones who taught us how to do it. They're the Native Americans who used to roam the west of these United States or the First Nation in Canada. They are the Australian Aborigines who used to roam the northern part of Australia free to be nomadic. I've just come back from Africa, and what I also know is that we have crimped the style of many native Africans and their tribal, nomadic nature by making them into states and governments and making civilization in the sense of being nomadic. During this past month, we're still at it. The Israelis are beginning to put up fences, keeping out the old Bedouin people from roaming around that part of Israel. What does all this say about the spokes and about the unseen nature? Just this, is that you and I are bid to be pilgrim people, and that you and I are on a mission and a journey, and we have to hold things lightly. I hope that's why St. Michaelites come to church. Of course, to receive comfort and hope in the midst of anxieties like my friend who lost her farmhouse. But more than that, to realize all of the journey that you and I have left, all the days that you and I will spend from here and unto eternity after our death. But this side of heaven, how much more opportunities you and I have to live this pilgrim life. I hope we come to church also to confess that we have been shaped too much, too often, by the things of the world, by those things that we hold on to tightly. More than heirlooms, they're the things that we press forward, we press onto, we hold tightly. I hope that we know that we've been shaped by those realities. And I also hope that we come to church because we have just sung in our opening hymn, "Before the world's eternal throne, you and I bow down with sacred joy." I learned in Africa this past 2 weeks that years ago there's an old fable about a white hunter who went into near Botswana, where we were just visiting. And in that fable, that parable, it's told that the difference between the white man and the black man in Africa is that the white man has, quote, and the black man is, quote. The white man has possessions, the black man is in pilgrimage. In other words, possession is no substitute for being. And on the spiritual journey, you and I are bid to travel light. To discover spiritual wholeness, then, in the midst of all the challenges that can happen this side of heaven, is to know ourselves to be pilgrim people. The Scriptures talk about it in this way: to have a new heaven and a new earth, to be in an exodus, moving from a land of imprisonment to a land of freedom, to be in the New Jerusalem, which anticipates singing a new song, to be the new wine pressed into old wineskins, or in the Apostle Paul's words to the Corinthians, "If anyone is in Christ, she or he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come." Or in today's text from chapter 4, "For though we're an outer nature, that part is wasting away. Our inner nature is being renewed day by day." So the Apostle Paul raises a very central question for all of us. How are we to discover spiritual wholeness in the midst of all the challenges that can happen to us? By seeing the whole story, the entire epic of your life and how we fit into the whole of the gospel story, by holding all things lightly, and by seeing ourselves as a pilgrim people. It's a high calling. It requires all of us to see ourselves more than just an old hen in the dark corner of despair. Or as Paul says, For though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. We look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen, they are eternal. Amen.